So please, ladies and gentlemen, join me in welcoming Mr. Ahmed Rashid.
Well, thank you very much. I have to admit that I almost didn't come. Jim Matlock was incredibly persuasive. My geography of the US was not very good, and the first thing a friend told me, I didn't know anything about Camden or Maine, for that matter, and the first thing they said, Maine? That's near the Arctic Circle. I mean, you're going there in February? I mean, you're going to be frozen. I mean, don't even bother. And then the second thing I heard was, Camden? That's where all the CIA retire. I mean, you want to go and address the CIA? I mean, how's that going to look on your file in the ISI? So it was only the persuasion of some very dear friends, old friends in the State Department, who I said, you have to come, because it's not just the CIA, we're here also. So thank God for the State Department. That's all I can say. Well, Nick, thank you for those very kind words. I met Nick many years ago when he was ambassador in Brussels, and he invited me kindly, along with a couple of other people, to address the NATO ambassadors. And I realized then what a tough time you were having, and the subsequent ambassadors were having, in getting NATO to commit the kind of resources that were needed in Afghanistan. Anyway, let me just start by saying that almost a year ago, the US military delivered, in my opinion, the most decisive point of view to the new incoming Obama administration, which was the war in Afghanistan could not be won. Now, there could not be a military victory against the Taliban. Now, I think that was really the start of everything we've seen since then. I think that was a very important decision, because what that meant was that US strategy then had to move towards finding an end to the war. It could not be ended by victory. It could not be ended by military means. It could only ultimately be ended by some kind of dialogue with the enemy, the Taliban. Not obviously with Al-Qaeda, but with the Taliban. And that process, in a sense, that we went through the March speech by President Obama, and the surge that happened in March last year, and then, of course, the December speech, and the surge that is happening right now, and the offensive that we are seeing now. But essentially, the fact remains that neither the Americans nor its Western allies in NATO are going to be prepared for another long-term commitment to Afghanistan. Now, the war in Afghanistan has gone on the longest in living memory, 9 years for Western nations, 30 years for the Afghans, if you can think of that. That's in Afghanistan terms, that's almost 3 generations, actually, of young people. And people are very tired. So in a sense that the war has to come to an end. We are no longer talking about bringing democracy to Afghanistan. We are no longer talking about even perhaps nation building in Afghanistan. We're no longer talking about any of the things that the Bush administration set out in 2001 to do, but then failed to do. So my talk about Afghanistan is largely going to be how do we bring the war to an end. What is the situation? Well, the situation is quite dire. 2 years ago, the Taliban were essentially a Pashtun movement in the south and the east of the country. It was an insurgency that was spreading amongst the Pashtun population in these areas. There were insufficient Western troops to deal with it. There was a very weak government and an even weaker army and local police force to deal with it. But today, the Taliban movement has spread across the country. It is now a nationwide movement. It is in the west. It is in the north. It is even in the heartland of what used to be the territories controlled by the Northern Alliance, the non-Pashtuns. And the Taliban are now right on the border with Central Asia, which has actually done a great deal to change a lot of the attitudes of Russia and the Central Asian republics. So secondly, it has not only spread in Afghanistan, it has become a regional movement. Today we have Pakistani Taliban, of which I'll be speaking about, which are, in a sense, in my opinion, even more dangerous than the Afghan Taliban. They pose a greater ideological threat to the state of Pakistan than even the Afghan Taliban. You have the equivalent of Taliban in Central Asia. These are Central Asians, Chechens, Russian Muslims who have been fighting and training with the Pakistani and Afghan Taliban and are now trying to re-enter Central Asia. And you have the potential of the Taliban ideology being spread by extremist groups into India, partly from Pakistan, but partly also by a minority of the Muslim population in India itself. You have a very weak president who has been enormously discredited by the elections that took place last August in Afghanistan. The elections were massively rigged, unfortunately. There was very little apology or self-abasement by President Karzai. He's lost an enormous amount of credibility. But really, neither the Afghans nor the West nor the US were faced with any other choice but to carry on with him as a partner. Now, certainly in any kind of counterinsurgency mode or any attempt to try and bring peace and bring the war to an end, to have a weak local partner is about the worst thing that can happen. But unfortunately, this is the situation. Thirdly, there is still 9 years on, there is still no national economy in Afghanistan, not even the national economy that predated the Soviets. In 9 years, we have not been able to build what existed in Afghanistan in the late 1970s, before the Soviet invasion. Afghanistan was never a rich country. It was never, but essentially it was an agricultural country that was, it grew its own food, it exported some agricultural goods, but we've not even been able to create the infrastructure that existed then, which was a minimalist infrastructure, or even the economy that existed then, which was, again, a very minimalist economy that barely managed to feed its population. On the other hand, let me say that the Taliban are not popular. In the most recent poll carried out by the BBC, only 6% of Afghans wanted a Taliban government. And I think that's more or less true. The Taliban have spread through intimidation, through harassment, through forced conscription, and to some extent, because they, in many areas, they have offered a kind of administration and justice that the government has just not been able to offer. And this has been, an enormous failure of the Western presence in Afghanistan for so many years, and of course the Afghan government. Now, how did we get from a situation in 2002, 2003, when there was no insurgency, when you could have rebuilt the country at 1/10 the price that is needed now, and 1/10 the effort and troops that are needed now? Well, in a simple word, I won't dwell on this because I think you know all this already. But in a simple word, the word was Iraq. I think Iraq sucked up the US resources, troops, money, every kind of effort. And the setbacks that were initially met with after the invasion of Iraq, I think demoralized a lot of Americans, and it became very difficult to argue for increased resources for Afghanistan. But there was also no vision of the previous administration as to what was going to be the end game. What was going to happen with the Pashtun population? Initially, for the first 2 or 3 years, the Americans treated the Pashtuns, virtually the entire Pashtun ethnic group, as the enemy, because the Taliban came from the Pashtuns. There was very little development carried out there. And the Pashtuns were never brought particularly well into the mainstream, even though, of course, the leadership of Afghanistan, with President Karzai and the people around him, were also largely Pashtun. But the large bulk of the Pashtuns remained alienated from the country. Thirdly, there was no admittance by the Bush administration that Pakistan had become the main sanctuary for the Afghan Taliban leadership. The first time that the Bush administration admitted that this was the case was in 2007, which was pretty late. There was a relationship with Pakistan which was dependent on Pakistan going after Al-Qaeda, which it did initially and captured many senior Al-Qaeda people. But after that, by 2004, 2005, Pakistan even stopped doing that. So the factor of the sanctuary was critical because as we know, and as you know very well from Vietnam and from, we know recently from Northern Ireland, or we know from other national liberation movements, Marxist movements in Africa and in Asia, no insurgency can survive unless there's a sanctuary. And if there is a sanctuary, you can't defeat that insurgency. So the key political task of the Bush administration and of this administration, which it is now acknowledging, has to be the end of this sanctuary. And the sanctuary was not just a sanctuary for the leadership, for their families. It was a sanctuary for money, for resources, for ammunition, for food, for recruits, for everything else. So I think these were some of the major reasons why the situation has steadily worsened rather than improved. Now, let me just talk briefly about what has come with this administration. I think, with this message that went out at the beginning of the Obama administration was also a very dramatic change in the US military's attitude towards fighting a counterinsurgency war. And that, of course, was the whole new philosophy is that you have to fight for the people and with the people and inside the people rather than go chasing the insurgents themselves. And I think that has had a very profound impact on the Western forces. NATO has been very slow to change towards these new tactics, but it is changing. And both the surges in March and December have been heavily dependent on this new strategy. And the offensive we're seeing in Marja today is also all about that, to go into a Taliban-controlled area where there is a significant population which needs to be won over, and then to be able to hold that area, and then to be able to bring in governance and development and be able to create something there which will convince the people that the government is effective. Now, 3 or 4 things I'll just list as what I think this administration is trying to do. It has acknowledged the failure of economic development, and there is a very serious attempt now, for example, to invest in agriculture. This is the first time in 9 years, that there has been real effort being put into agriculture, which is the lifeblood for 80% of the population. There is a civilian surge. There are much larger resources. There's an awareness that the economy has not taken off and the infrastructure has not been adequately provided. Kabul got electricity only last year with a electricity line that came down from Uzbekistan. So 8 years, Kabulis have really not had any electricity. How can you expect an economy to take off or industry to happen or anything else to happen without electricity? There has been an acknowledgement of the sanctuary issue, which I think has been pursued very vigorously by this administration, although not with completely positive results, which I'll go into. And finally, there has been a recognition that Pakistan's interests and Pakistan's conflict with India is now playing a major problem in order to conclude the war in Afghanistan. One other point is that the fear of the regional countries getting re-involved in Afghanistan has also been addressed by this administration. The fact is that during the Bush period, we had no engagement by the neighbors of Afghanistan. Afghanistan is a landlocked country. It has 6 neighbors, all of whom have been gross at interfering in Afghanistan. They fueled the civil war in the 1990s. And it has a number of large near neighbors who have been equally interfering. Russia, India, Saudi Arabia, the Gulf states. And so clearly what was needed was a regional strategy that would bring the neighbors together and try and create some kind of consensus among them that they would not interfere in Afghanistan. Now, the end result of all this, of this last 1 year, has been the London Conference, which ended a few weeks ago, in which 67 nations came together and endorsed the idea of reintegrating mid-level Taliban commanders and foot soldiers into bringing them into the government. And the Americans, NATO, the Afghan government have launched various schemes with quite a lot of funding and money to do that. So for the first time now, there is a recognition, and there's a recognition that the need to talk to the Taliban is paramount. Now, I think that recognition has come about not just because of the situation and the deterioration in Afghanistan. It has also come about because of the very dramatic changes that are happening in the capitals of the world, in which public opinion is now vastly against a further commitment to Afghanistan. Most Europeans want their troops out. And for the first time, I think the American public has registered more than 50% of the American public want American troops out of Afghanistan. In Europe, it's 70, 80% in some countries like Spain and Germany. And this, in fact, has become a kind of deciding factor. President Obama's last speech stated that in June 2011, the Americans want to start pulling out some troops and handing over control to the Afghan army and the police. And that's why there's been an enormous investment taking place right now in building up the Afghan army and the police. Now, I will at the end talk to you how successful or unsuccessful this administration has been. But let me just now, let's talk about the Taliban. The Taliban have developed enormously as a military force. And that's been partly with the help of the sanctuary that they've had, their access to the world. You've had Taliban commanders travel to Iraq with al-Qaeda, be able to learn from the Iraqi al-Qaeda and the insurgency there. They brought back with them this whole new, the whole new technology of IEDs and mine warfare, which was something relatively new to the Taliban in the 90s when they were fighting the Northern Alliance. They have developed militarily to the extent that they brought back suicide. Suicide bombing has been introduced as a major tool and weapon for them. This was something, again, given to them by al-Qaeda and by some of the Pakistani extremist groups that were fighting with them. But at the same time, politically, they have not really developed. There are areas in which the Taliban have excelled. Media, for example, being able to get their message out. Being able to acknowledge attacks and the killings of Western troops and all the rest of it, they have been very effective. But as far as their political agenda is concerned, they haven't gone very, they don't have an economic agenda. They don't have a social agenda. They've been very reluctant to talk about education. And as we know, in the 1990s, they banned all girls and women from education. So the Afghan people realize this, that the Taliban are not a force that we can welcome back because they offer absolutely nothing in terms of politics and economics. All they do offer in the field and is a kind of crude Islamic justice, and that is significant only because there's no other justice. There's the rule of law, a government order, a court system. None of this exists in huge and vast areas of the country. So the first thing is that now I think the Taliban also realize that they have reached the kind of zenith of how far they can go. They have enormous capacity in rural areas. They can spread further in rural areas. They can attack Kabul. They can launch suicide missions in all the major cities. But they can't take the cities because of Western firepower. They can't take major population centers. They can't mobilize the population entirely in their favor. For example, we have not seen in Afghanistan a big surge in anti-Americanism, as we saw in Iraq for several years, which crossed Shia and Sunni factions in Iraq. The Afghan people still believe, by and large, that as long as Western forces are here, there's going to, maybe some development will come to us. Maybe some, we'll be able to move forward on economic development, which the Taliban can't do. So I think this has been a very important factor in making the Taliban realize that perhaps if the Americans have now set a deadline, which, by the way, everyone in the region has taken, that the Americans are leaving, although that is not the case. I mean, we know that American troops will remain perhaps for several years. There'll be trainers there. But both the Taliban and the Afghan government and many of the regional countries, including Pakistan, have concluded now that the Americans are on the way out, and that Obama will not be able to sustain this, certainly not into 2012, when the next presidential elections take place. So this is one reason why I think the Taliban are perhaps getting more amenable to the idea of talks. Now, many people ask me, why should the Taliban talk right now? One option for them certainly is to sit out the next 18 months and to wait for the Americans to leave. It'll just be like the Soviets, except the Soviets all left in one go. They didn't leave anyone behind. But even then, with the Americans leaving, there'll be a rush for the exits from many of the NATO countries. Many of the NATO countries are only hanging in there because the Americans are there. The moment a few American troops leave, many of these European countries will also start leaving. So that certainly is an option for some of the hardliners. But I think at the same time, they also realize that Western firepower is not going to allow them to conquer the country or conquer Kabul as they did in the 90s. I think the vast majority of the Taliban are tired. They're extremely tired of the war. They've suffered enormous casualties. But I think two other factors are driving them. One is that they are very fed up with the kind of manipulation that they've been subjected to by Pakistan's ISI and the military. And there has been a lot of micro-management that has been done of the Taliban. Similar to the kind of micromanagement that was done in the 1990s for the militant groups who were fighting in Indian Kashmir. Now, the Taliban are very tired of that. And ultimately, for many of the Taliban, this jihad is a jihad, but it's also a struggle. It's a patriotic struggle. It's a nationalist struggle. It is a struggle to strengthen Pashtun hegemony in Afghanistan as it has existed for 250 years. So there are political reasons why perhaps the Taliban are amenable to talks. Now, I'll just touch briefly on this recent arrest, as I'm sure many of you are interested. Mullah Brother is a very important number two of the Taliban, very close to Mullah Omar, very responsible for the war, for finances, for supplies. And this is not the kind of person who would be talking to the Kabul government or to others without, I think, without the approval of the main Taliban Shura. Now, Mullah Brother actually has been in contact with the Kabul government. He has traveled to Saudi Arabia. He has been meeting with the Saudis and with members of the Kabul regime. And there has been a dialogue that has been going on for about a year that has not really taken off in any concrete way, but we have seen signs of moderation in some of the Taliban statements. For example, there is a kind of commitment in their statements which is saying that they're willing to break with al-Qaeda, which of course is the major demand of the United States. There is a commitment that they will not interfere in the affairs of neighboring countries. The last statement, and their statements are now not full of Islamic zeal and jihad, but they're full of nationalism and patriotism, and we are all Afghans together, and that's a very big shift. And the last statement I read just a few days ago, for the first time actually talked about that we're not against education and women's education. Now, obviously, these are statements, and I'm not putting much into these statements. They have to be proven. And of course, the big issue is, I mean, if you're breaking with al-Qaeda and you have such a close relationship with al-Qaeda, how do you actually break with al-Qaeda? How are you going to demonstrate that to the Americans, to the Afghan government, to other neighboring countries that you've actually broken with al-Qaeda? Nevertheless, these talks have gone ahead. I believe that these arrests were more of a result of an accident, perhaps. If you've read the New York Times today, that's finally what it says. There's been a lot of talk about Pakistan changing its attitude and now cooperating. Frankly, I don't believe that. I think, and I'll go into this, Pakistan still determines that the Afghan Taliban are a very useful ally. But Pakistan also wants to determine that if there is going to be a dialogue with the Afghan Taliban and the Kabul government and possibly the Americans or others, other players, Pakistan has to be the main broker and mediator in this. And it has a very tough set of conditions it wants the international community to meet before it becomes a broker. So in part, I think this is an accident. I think this guy was picked up because there was some leak somewhere, and it seems that CIA officials were there and were able to monitor some phone calls, and the ISI was forced to move, picked up these guys, and I think the silence has been largely because, and the story broke very late. The silence has been because I think there must be a lot of debate going on now within Pakistan as to exactly what to do with Brother. The issue is that by being arrested like this, if Brother was going to be the main conduit for talks, he has been tainted now, in a sense. Because having been arrested, certainly he can't be freed, but if he's to be used by the Pakistanis, then he will come under suspicion from the Taliban as well as from the Afghan government. And the Afghan government has been quite upset at these arrests because they were dealing with Brother. Now, the last part of this talking to the Taliban is the ethnic factor. Karzai, one of his big weaknesses in this dialogue is that he's used members of his family to carry out this dialogue with the Taliban. It has not been a proper governmental effort, which has to include members of the Northern Alliance. Unless you're going to get the Tajiks and the Uzbeks and the other ethnic groups involved, at the moment the Northern Alliance is dead against this dialogue. And to get them involved is going to be incredibly important because on that will rest the future stability of Afghanistan. Now, I don't want to go very deeply into what I see as an endgame, but I do see a dialogue taking place. There will have to be some kind of power-sharing arrangements. But one thing I will say that I don't think Afghans are ready, and nor is the international community, that the progress that has been made in Afghanistan, and there has been progress in education, in health, especially in the social sector, this progress cannot be set back. You're not going to have, at the end of whatever process takes place, at the end of 1 year or 2 years, a Taliban demanding that girls' education has to be scrapped. I don't think this is an issue. I think even the Taliban down the road will have to recognize that the progress that has taken place has to stay and be developed. Now let me move on to Pakistan. We have two major problems that have caused instability in Pakistan. One is, for 60 years, there is still no consensus on the national identity. What is the national identity? Is this an Islamic state? Or is this a democratic national state for Muslims and for all other ethnic and religious groups? There's no agreement on this. And secondly, even more dangerous for the state, and I think this is what Nick talked about, this is the sort of crux of the issue, is that there's a huge gulf between what the army considers as national security and what the civilians consider as national security. The army and we've been ruled by the army for half our life, the army has turned the country into a national security state because of the perceived threat from India. So the army gets a huge chunk of the budget, it runs its own economy, it has banks, property, land, we have 1 million men under arms, we have nuclear weapons. We have become, according to the army, we constantly need, the army constantly needs to prepare and propagandize the population to face up to the Indian threat. India is about to go to war. The latest is India now has this new strategy of cold start, which is that India can launch an attack on Pakistan in 72 hours. Now, I think at a time of when both countries are armed with nuclear weapons, I think war is really not an option, obviously. But this concept of the national security state is very seriously pursued by the army. And this is also the main problem with relations with the United States, because it sees the U.S. as a threat, as a big power that has sided with India, as a big power that ultimately wants to undermine the army and undermine Pakistan and strengthen the civilian sector. On the other hand, you have the civilians. Now, the civilian concept of national security is very clear. We believe in development, in good neighborliness, in trade, in education, in women's rights, and most civilian governments have tried to do this, but they have always been stymied because the military has remained such a preponderant force. Now, and I would really say to you that this gulf in defining national security. I mean, can you imagine if the Pentagon has one view of national security and the State Department has another view? How is the government and the country going to function? So this is the problem we face, and the gulf between the two is actually widening. And this present political regime that is weak, that is ineffective, whatever, that is tainted with corruption and all the rest of it, has not helped its own case. But nor has the army. So we are faced with this prospect of a widening gulf. Who is going to bridge this gulf? Is there a leadership that can bridge this gulf? At the moment, there's no such leadership, neither in the civil side nor on the military side. So I think this is the crux of the problem we face. Now, there are 4 crises in Pakistan right now, 5, which I'll just briefly touch on. One is a political crisis. And this is the age-old political crisis, army versus civil. The army, for the first time, has the support of the judiciary, which is going after the civilian government. So every few weeks, there's a legal or constitutional or judicial crisis which paralyzes the government, which leads to all sorts of media speculation that the government is about to be toppled by the army, or President Zardari is about to resign, and leads to complete paralysis. But for the first time, and I think this is a major positive development, the army does not have a political party that it can use to try and topple the government. The fundamentalist parties who've always been opposed to the People's Party and democracy and has always sided with the army are against the army. Other political parties have refused to sign up with the army. Invariably, what happened in the past. We had military coups because there was a government which was ineffective or weak, and the opposition would line up with the army and ask the army to take over. This is not happening this time. But nevertheless, the political crisis continues. We have a very severe economic recession, which predates the global recession and was really related to the Musharraf regime's era, in which Pakistan received large amounts of aid, 7 billion from the U.S. between 12 billion from the U.S. between 2001 and 2007. 80% of that went to the military, and we saw nothing of that. And thankfully, I mean, the new administration is making a very dramatic change in that with the Kerry-Lugar bill and money committed to, for the civilian sector. But the economic recession is dire. I come from Lahore, the largest city in the country, a city of 9-10 million people, and we don't have electricity for 16 hours a day this winter. When I left, that was the state. Now, I can afford a generator, but the majority of people can't. We had no gas the whole winter. I mean, there's a huge economic crisis of joblessness, and of course, this is only fueling extremism. Thirdly, there's an insurgency in Balochistan. This is the 5th insurgency in Balochistan. Its roots are economic and political and social. But, and the government has made an enormous effort at having a Balochistan peace package, which is going to try and give them more revenue and more rights and more control over their natural resources. But again, the problem is that so far the army has not endorsed this package. And we have, so this insurgency is carrying on. It's quite separate from the Taliban insurgency. The danger of this insurgency is that it has moved from being an insurgency, and previous Baloch insurgencies were about getting the rights for the Baloch people equal to other ethnic groups in Pakistan. It has now become a separatist insurgency. They want to create an independent Balochistan. And this is remains a very serious issue. And lastly, I'll talk about the Pakistani Taliban briefly. But before that, I mean, tomorrow I hope Samina will talk about civil society and the advances that have been made. There have been huge advances, as there have been in Afghanistan. There has been progress in the last 8 years in the media, in women's rights, in education, in civil society. Civil society was really responsible for getting Musharraf out. After all the unrest that happened. So this is an important plus, an important positive factor. But civil society is still too weak to actually carry out the function that I said of bridging this gap between these two concepts of national security. Now, on the Pakistani Taliban, let me just say that, as you know, the Pakistani Taliban really emerged. I mean, the Pakistani Taliban have been around since the Mujahideen days. Thousands of Pakistani Pashtuns went to fight the Soviets with the Afghan Mujahideen. Thousands, tens of thousands of Pakistani Pashtuns went to fight for the Taliban against the Northern Alliance in the 1990s. So there's been a long history of radicalization in the tribal areas and the border with Afghanistan. But what really tipped the balance was the arrival of the Afghan Taliban and Al-Qaeda into the region, into the Pakistani Pashtun region after 9/11. Once they were defeated, they all came and settled there. And for years, for 3 years, the army didn't touch them. They were allowed to live there, and consequently, and they paid extremely well. The Pakistani hosts became very rich. They started off with a few bodyguards. They set up their militias. Then they began to develop their own ideology, and the Pakistani Taliban slowly emerged as a group which had several functions. One was to protect Al-Qaeda and the Afghan Taliban, because they paid for that protection. Secondly, was to enlarge the area under their control, because that benefited both the Pakistani Taliban and it benefited Al-Qaeda and the Afghan Taliban, because it widened their scope of operations. They could bring in foreigners for training, etc. And thirdly, the Pakistani Taliban developed their own if you like, national Islamic ideology, which was to create an Islamic state, first in the tribal areas, then in the Pashtun areas, and now they are determined to try and create an Islamic state, topple the existing status quo, and create an Islamic state in the rest of Pakistan. Now, when the army did move in 2004 for the first time into the tribal areas, they conducted a policy until last year of half-hearted offensives coupled with peace deals, which only allowed the Pakistani Taliban to expand their grip. And it was only after the army began to really feel suicide attacks and then the Pakistani Taliban's expansion into Swat, into this valley north of Islamabad, which really convinced the army to go after the Pakistani Taliban. Now, I think today the army has very decisively decided that the Pakistani Taliban have to be crushed. And that is very positive. Public opinion is very much behind this. Public opinion is fed up with these suicide attacks and the kind of disruption that the Taliban are causing countrywide. But the problem, one of the major problems, is that many of the extremist groups in the rest of the country who are fighting in Kashmir and fighting with India have now joined up with the Pakistani Taliban. So like in Afghanistan, we have the potential. It's there in form and shape, although it's not fully utilized. We have the potential for a nationwide Taliban movement. Because you've got extremist groups in Punjab, in Karachi, in Sindh, all over the country, and they've been carrying out suicide attacks. Many of the suicide attacks you hear in places like Lahore are not carried out by Pashtuns from the Pakistani Taliban. They're carried out by local extremists, Punjabis, local boys, from the local group. So even though the army has moved against the Pakistani Taliban, the Pashtun element of the Pakistani Taliban, they have still not moved in any shape or form against the other non-Pashtun groups who have joined up with the Taliban. And that's because of India. Because these groups still remain, even though they're fighting the army, many of these groups still remain the front line for any kind of conflict with India. And of course, they have also their own potential, as we saw in Mumbai. We had one of these groups launch this attack in Mumbai, which literally has paralyzed India-Pakistan relations for so long. Only now, next week, are talks going to start between India and Pakistan after more than a year of no dialogue between the two countries. So the Pakistani Taliban are still a potential threat. And until the army decides that all extremists in Pakistan, I mean, some have to be dealt with militarily. Some, like many of these groups who have been fighting the Indians in the 1990s, many of these groups can be dismantled in a more benign way, rehabilitation, re-education, etc. They don't perhaps have to be driven, they don't have to be dismantled militarily. But there has to be a common policy. There cannot be this differentiation between the extremists and the Pashtun extremists who have to be crushed and the Punjabi extremists who are okay, because they're, they will eventually line up with us and fight India if we have to fight India. Now, I think this is where the critical factor now is of what Pakistan wants with the Afghan Taliban. Pakistan does not still consider the Afghan Taliban as a threat, either to itself. In fact, it considers the Afghan Taliban as a strategic ball that it can play with when the end game starts in Afghanistan. And this is why I think the military and the intelligence is determined that the mediation and if there is to be a dialogue with the Afghan Taliban, it has to go through Islamabad rather than go through Kabul. Now, this is going to create immense problems. This is going to be unacceptable to the Kabul regime. It's going to be unacceptable to the non-Pashtuns in Afghanistan, the Northern Alliance. It's going to be unacceptable to most of the Pashtuns in Afghanistan. And it's going to be unacceptable to India. India is not going to vouchsafe a deal that goes through Islamabad. It's going to be unacceptable to Iran. It's going to be unacceptable, ultimately, even probably to the Taliban. Because the Taliban are not going to be allow Pakistan, which wants its own terms and conditions set for those negotiations, to negotiate on its behalf. So I think this administration is now faced with a very serious dilemma. First, it has to decide whether it is ready to negotiate or help Karzai negotiate with, I mean, I don't think the Americans should do it themselves. I think it should be through Karzai. But this administration has still not decided whether it is in favor of negotiations with the senior leadership of the Taliban. Now, clearly, some more measures would have to be taken by the Taliban, such as a more demonstrative effect as to their break with al-Qaeda or whatever. And ultimately, if the Taliban are going to be in some kind of power-sharing arrangement, the only true test of their faith in taking part in a power-sharing arrangement and breaking with al-Qaeda would be that they would have to go after al-Qaeda themselves. This is going to be the most difficult part, because the only people who can get al-Qaeda or the remnants of al-Qaeda in this region are the Taliban themselves, because they know exactly where they are. So, and basically, of course, this would be the grand betrayal that would have to happen before we could really move forward on any kind of power sharing. But so this administration has to decide that if first of all, if it's going to talk to if it's going to acknowledge talks with the Taliban and support Karzai and think that it's a good thing, and then get regional countries and allies and NATO and others lined up behind it. The other big decision is, and very sensitive decision is, how it is going to play with the Pakistani military and what kind of role it's going to give. Because as I just pointed out, many of the people around and inside Afghanistan are going to object to this. And is the US then going to do exactly what it did in 1989, which was to walk away from Afghanistan and tell the Pakistanis and possibly the Saudis, although the Saudis are not interested now, and tell the Pakistanis, well, Afghanistan is yours, the Pashtun areas are yours, you handle it. And that's exactly what the Americans did after '89. And of course, that's what led to the civil war in Afghanistan and the arrival of Al-Qaeda and all the rest of it. And that would be lethal right now, because it would create an immediate crisis in Afghanistan and possibly the breakdown of everything and possibly a civil war. Because one thing the Afghans do not want is to be handled once again by the ISI and by the Pakistani military. This is what you left them with in 1989. And this is a question that this administration would have to cope with, that if it goes through Pakistan just for reasons, for other reasons, nuclear reasons, relations with India reasons, then this would be a very big a problem in the region. Now, let me just finally just sum up and tell you where I think this administration has succeeded and not succeeded. As far as its desire to create a regional strategy, it has so far failed to do so. That's because the region has actually deteriorated in the last 1 year. We had Mumbai, we had a crisis between India and Pakistan, we had a very severe deterioration with Iran, obviously, with the elections and now the nuclear thing. Idealists like myself were hoping at the beginning of this administration that perhaps, the Americans could somehow siphon off the Afghan issue and talk to the Iranians on the Afghan issue and leave the other strategic issues for, another day or another forum. But obviously, things don't happen like this, and clearly the deterioration in Iran now and the danger of Iran acquiring nuclear weapons and all makes this impossible. If Iran is not a partner in some kind of regional understanding on Afghanistan, Iran can be a major spoiler. And clearly this would be one of its intentions. So the regional strategy is not going anywhere at the moment, unfortunately. Indo-Pak is not going anywhere. The idea that you had to reduce India-Pakistan tensions in Kabul. You had to get the Pakistanis to accept that the Indians would be in Afghanistan. But you had to also control the Indians to make sure that they were not arming or funding the Baloch insurgency, that they were not trying to undermine Pakistan from its consulates and embassies in Afghanistan, which is what the Pakistanis believe that is happening. So unfortunately, that process has not gone anywhere. And maybe now with the talks starting between the two countries, it can happen. On the ground in Afghanistan, I think it's very unlikely that the Afghan army and police are going to be ready in 18 months' time. You have chronic problems. You've got illiteracy problems, leadership problems, recruitment problems, because many Pashtuns from the south are not sufficiently being recruited into the military. And I don't think the Afghan army is going to be in a position to take major responsibility. It could take responsibility of cities, for example, where there would be quick backup by Western troops. But to take control of large chunks of the countryside, province by province, I don't think can happen very fast. The civilian surge, the development, the money now being put into things like agriculture and electricity and trying to get some industry growing and processing of agricultural goods and going, is going to depend on the security situation. And you've given yourself only 18 months in the region's terms, in the sense that you've given yourself 18 months to do a surge and then to wind down that surge. And I don't see economic development being able to pick up that quickly, because simply security is not going to pick up that quickly. It's going to take that long to secure just these key areas which are being dominated by the Taliban, the poppy growing areas like Helmand, which are providing finance for the Taliban. For example, the provinces around Kabul, within 10, 20 miles of Kabul, are controlled by the Taliban. You're going to need a very large offensive in the spring and summer to clear these provinces of the Taliban. Now, so in a sense, there are large population centers that have to be cleared of Taliban control completely before you can bring in this new counterterrorism strategy. Now, whether there are going to be sufficient troops, sufficient time, and sufficient backup by NATO and all the rest of it to do this is a very big question mark. Thirdly, the issue of the Pakistan sanctuary is still there. I think this administration has launched a very determined campaign to deal with this issue. And that's been appreciated by the Afghan government. It's met with enormous resistance from the military, as you have sensed. For example, the military has, for a time, refused to accept the Kerry-Lugar bill, which was going to give Pakistan $1.5 billion a year for 5 years for civilian purposes. It's led to US diplomats and AID workers not getting visas. Now that has nothing to do with the civilian government. That's just blocking, a blocking process to tell the Americans that, look, you can't dictate to us on whether we want to keep the Taliban here, the Afghan Taliban here or not. So I hope that these arrests and all will lead to a slow weakening of this position. But for the time being, at least, the Afghan Taliban are still seen as the best bet by the Pakistani military as far as its own future of influence and some degree of control in Afghanistan is concerned, and in particular combating Indian presence and India's role in Afghanistan is concerned. So I think the intentions of this administration are extremely good, and I think it's trying very hard. But on this checklist, very little so far has been achieved. And we are now faced with a very short time period in which the rest has to be achieved. And it's going to be very difficult. It's not going to happen unless there's major breakthroughs with some of these regional countries. It's not also going to happen unless President Karzai gets his act together. Fortunately, he has allowed some very good people around him. The cabinet around him is composed of some very good technocrats, and some of the opposition leaders like Ashraf Ghani and others are working for the government. But Karzai, unfortunately, remains uninterested, in governance, in good governance. It's not an issue that he feels. He still believes that Afghanistan doesn't need good governance. Afghanistan is a tribal society, and it needs to be governed as my father governed and my grandfather governed, and that is a huge problem for the West, because the two-part plan for Obama is you need Karzai to do good governance, and you need Karzai to talk to the Taliban. Now, he's not interested in good governance. That is the problem. He is very interested in the Taliban, and I suspect for two reasons. He's trying to go one step ahead of the Americans even, because he is now, in fact, wanting to have a dialogue. He's asked for a dialogue with Mullah Omar, with all the top leaders of the Taliban. He's 1 or 2 steps ahead of the Americans in that. And in a way, he's trying to say that, look, I can save this country by talking to the Taliban, bringing the Taliban into government. I don't have to do good governance. If I can do the Taliban, I don't have to do the other part that the Americans want. And I think that's a major problem, and it's a huge, huge mistake. Because at the end of the day, what is going to sustain Afghanistan against, if you like, extremist encroaches by the Taliban is going to be governance, and all the issues with development and all the issues that surround governance. So, and thirdly, he has to be more inclusive of bringing in the Northern Alliance and bringing in the northern groups. I also think he should bring in women. I think women should be part of the negotiating team with the Taliban. The Taliban should be made aware that that women have made enormous progress in these 9 years. There are 4 or 5 million girls in school. None of this can be set back. So I think on the one hand, women's rights can be protected by including them in the dialogue process. And secondly, I think Afghan women also have to play a role in engaging with the Taliban, to assert to the Taliban that they cannot be treated as they were in the 1990s. And I think, these issues I'm addressing really because they're of enormous concern, and Hillary Clinton has talked about this as being her #1 priority and all the rest of it, and I can understand that. But I think, this is really at the end of it. Ultimately, let me just say one thing about Afghanistan, two things. One, it is a tribal society. It has enormous absorptive capacity. In Parliament today, there are communists from the worst period of the Soviet era who tortured to death thousands of people who are sitting in Parliament today. Corps commanders of the Afghan Communist Army. There are people from Gulbuddin Hikmatyar's Hizb-e-Islami. There are 21 members of his former Hizb-e-Islami members sitting in the Parliament today. Now, they have been absorbed into the system. They haven't been able, yes, they have a lobby. They have an Islamic lobby. They want Sharia law, this, that, etc. But, they have not been able to take over the system. Because ultimately, the system has allowed them to come in on the basis that they will accept that all Afghans have rights and all Afghans need to have a say. This is the basis of the Jirga system and the tribal system. And this is, so perhaps, the Taliban could also become a part of this absorptive capacity of this society. Secondly, I think, Americans have a much better understanding now of Afghanistan. But let me just say, this is a country that has kept together for 30 years. Nobody has been allowed to divide it. The Russians tried, the Pakistanis tried, the Iranians tried. No group in Afghanistan, no matter how horrendous, the most horrendous warlords that we have seen, even General Dostum, the worst human rights guy, etc., even he, with his Uzbeks, who the Russians were begging to create a separate Uzbek enclave just as they were leaving, refused to do it. Nobody, and the Taliban, nobody is prepared to split. No Afghan is prepared to split Afghanistan. This is of enormous benefit, I think, and something that Afghans are immensely proud of. And this is something that should be, part of Western strategy, acknowledging this strength that I think the Afghans have. The Afghans, remember, were never colonized. But the never colonized leads to this whole theory about, well, they'll never accept foreigners and all. But the real theory is that by never being colonized, they have stuck together. And they will stick together even in the future. I believe Iran, Pakistan, even perhaps India are more dangerous there are more dangers of fragmentation and fallout than there are in Afghanistan. Thank you very much. Okay. Thank you very much.